Hello. Welcome to Ancient Text Podcasts, Book 9 of Historia, regum, brittanae. Now that Uther was dead, the nobility from across Britain assembled at Silchester and proposed to Dubricius, Archbishop of Legions, that he should crown Arthur, Uther's son, to be their king. The country was now in peril as, having heard of the king's death, the Saxons invaded again from Germany, this time under the command of one Colgrin. They were going for the death blow. They wanted to destroy the Britons totally. The Saxons had already taken north of the island down to the River Humber, or Yorkshire. Dubricius, grieving for the calamities of his country, with the other bishops, crowned Arthur king. Arthur was only 15 years old, but he was a kid unmatched in courage and generosity, and was seen as a good guy generally and universally loved. When his coronation was over, as was tradition, he showered his subjects in generosity. He gave out lots of gifts. Then came Brythonic soldiers, hoping to also receive gifts, but there were so many of them Arthur just couldn't foot the bill. Jaffe writes here, but such a spirit of generosity, joined with valor, can never long be wanting means to support itself. End quote. Arthur, then, wanting to grant these men generosity and lavishness, resolved to courageously make war with the Saxons, so he could enrich his followers with his fallen enemy's wealth. Arthur also had a just claim to be the king of the entire island, so why not go for it? So Arthur assembled the youth under his command and marched on York. When Colgrin had been informed of this, the Saxons met Arthur with a very great army composed of Saxons, Scots, and Picts. A battle happened by the River Douglas. The majority of both armies perished, but the victory was Arthur's, who further pushed Colgrin to York and besieged him. Colgrin's brother, Baldulf, hearing that his brother had fled, went to the site of the siege with 6,000 troops to relieve his brother. At this time, Baldulf was situated on the seacoast waiting for Duke Cheldric to arrive with reinforcements from Germany. He was about 10 miles from York, so he planned to make a speedy march in the night and fall upon the Britons by surprise. Arthur caught wind of this strategy, however, so he sent a detachment of 600 cavalry and 3,000 infantry under the command of Cador, Duke of Cornwall, to meet Baldulf in the night. Cador then, coming upon the enemy on the same road they were traveling, made a sudden assault upon them, causing the Saxons to flee. Baldulf felt really bad he couldn't come to his brother's relief, so he began to think of another strategy to save him, one that would work. After some thinking and consulting, he came up with an idea. Baldulf shaved his head and beard and dressed up as a jester with a harp. In this disguise, he walked down into the Britons' camp, playing his instrument as if he was a wandering musician. He passed unsuspected until he finally got to the walls of the besieged York. Watchmen recognized him and lowered the ropes for him to climb up into the city. And they then brought Baldulf to his brother. The meeting was unexpected, and they joyfully hugged. Then they began to come up with strategies for their escape. They couldn't think of anything and considered themselves doomed until, surprise, news came that Cheldric had arrived with 600 ships full of soldiers. The Britons heard the news, and Arthur's advisors convinced them to flee from the situation, as they were about to face a very large and dangerous army. Arthur took his council's advice and retreated to London, where he called an assembly of all clergy and nobility of the kingdom and asked their advice as to what course to take against the formidable pagan forces. They came up with the very original idea of asking Armorica for help. So they said, they're going to turn to Armorica for, the very original Arthur. Okay. So they sent ambassadors to King Hole, who was Arthur's nephew by Arthur's sister and Dubricius, former king of the Armorican Britons. I'm not sure if that's the different Dubricius than the Bishop of Dubricius. I really don't know. Upon hearing the situation his uncle faced, Hole got ready a fleet and arrived with 15,000 men at Hamos Port. He was received with honor by Arthur and affectionately embraced by him. After a few days, they went to relieve the city. Car Lloyd Coit, that was very hard to pronounce. I have no idea if I'm even close there. Which was, I think, as the city of Lincoln is referring to, which was besieged by the pagans. It was situated on a mountain, in between two rivers, in the province of Lindisia. Again, Lincoln. Once they arrived there with all their forces, they fought the Saxons and totally manhandled them, killing 6,000, a fraction of which were drowned in the rivers, a fraction by the hands of the Britons, and the rest fled, but were closely pursued by Arthur, until they reached the Celadon Woods, where they tried to form a line of battle again and make a stand. They engaged the Britons in battle again and made a brave defense. The trees made for great covers from arrows. Arthur, seeing that the trees were an advantage to the Saxons, ordered them to be chopped down and to be used to build a wooden wall around the Saxons so that they could be trapped and starved out. He accomplished all this, then waited 3 days, besieging the woods. The Saxons, having ran out of food, were starving and begged to be let go, and in return promised to leave their gold and silver behind and return back to Germany with nothing but their ships. They even promised they would pay Arthur tribute from Germany and offer political hostages. I don't believe that. Arthur, after consulting his council, granted their offer, making sure the Saxons left all their money and treasure behind, as well as hostages. The Saxons left, and Saxons, being Saxons, welched on their part of the bargain and sailed back towards Britain, and they regrouped and came back to the port of Totnes. Once they landed, they acted murderously and rapaciously, killing every peasant they came across. They then marched towards the town of Bath and laid siege to it. When Arthur had intelligence of this, he was extremely surprised and gave order to immediately execute the Saxons held as political hostages. Arthur already had forces mobilized as he was planning to march on the Scots. He instead directed these forces with utmost speed to lift the siege. But under great difficulty, because he had left his nephew Hull sick at Alclode, he was running the army himself. Once Arthur had at long last entered the province of Somerset, he addressed his army with the following, quote, "Since these impious and detestable Saxons have disdained to keep faith with me, I, to keep faith with God, will endeavor to revenge the blood of my countrymen this day upon them. To arms, soldiers, to arms, and courageously fall upon the perfidious wretches, over whom we shall, with Christ assisting us, undoubtedly obtain the victory." End quote. Once Arthur had finished speaking, St. Dubricius, Archbishop of the City of Legions, I think it is a different Dubricius, because that's why it's listing the title every time it tells the name. So I think there's two different Dubriciuses. One is the king of Ormorico, one is Archbishop of Legions. Okay, so Dubricius, Archbishop of Legions, yelled a speech of his own, quote, "You that have the honor to profess the Christian faith, keep fixed in your mind the love which you owe your country and fellow subjects, whose suffering at the hands of the treacherous pagans will be an everlasting reproach to you, if you do not courageously defend from them. It is your country you're fighting for, and rightly, when required, voluntarily suffer death, for that itself is victory and the cure of the soul. For he that dies for his brethren offers himself a living sacrifice to God, and follows in the example of Christ, who humbly laid down his life for his brethren. If you shall be killed in this war, that death itself, suffered in such a glorious cause, shall be to the fallen penance and absolution of all of his sins." End quote. After this speech, all of the army, encouraged with holy religious vigor, took up arms and prepared to receive their orders. Arthur himself was equipped with a coat of armor suitable for his rank as a great king, a golden helmet on his head engraved with the figure of a dragon, and he carried his shield called Prewen, which was adorned with an icon of the Mother Mary, which was a Saint Arthur liked to be reminded of. On his belt he wore Caliburn, which is, of course, Excalibur, cognate with Excalibur, which Geoffrey explains here. Caliburn was an excellent sword. It was crafted on the mythical island of Avalon. Doesn't mention how he gets hold of it really here. According to Literary Academia, the Sword and the Stone story and the Lady of the Lake story didn't come until later Arthurian texts. Remember, this is what we're reading here is the first major Arthurian text, so all the legends aren't like quite fully cemented. So Excalibur exists, but the origin story for Excalibur is like not there. And in his right hand he held his spear Ron. That's a nice short name for a weapon. His spear Ron, which was hard, broad, and fit for killing. After drawing his men into battle lines, Arthur boldly attacked the Saxons, who drew their battle lines in the shape of a wedge. I just want to put a literary critic note here. Duke of Cornwall is a very, 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 very frequently referenced office in this book. Every major war that goes on, the Duke of Cornwall always has something to do with something. Anyways, back to the book. The Britons fought well, but the Saxons held their ground all day, and when night fell, the Saxons retreated to their camp in a nearby mountain, where they could hold out with their sheer numbers. The next morning, Arthur and his army ascended the mountain, losing many men in the process. The Saxons at this point were, of course, in an advantageous position, being able to hail down projectiles from above. After a hard struggle, the Britons gained the summit of the mountain and came to close engagement with the Saxons. The Saxons again gave a vigorous defense. Most of the day was spent in this engagement, and Arthur, seeing how little advantage he had gained, and that he had not gained the battle yet, drew out Excalibur and called upon the name of the Virgin Mary, then rushed forward into the thickest of the enemy ranks. Not one that his sword touch survived. He continued his assault until he had, with Excalibur alone, killed 470 men. The Britons, seeing this, followed their leader in great multitudes and made slaughter on all sides. The Saxons, Colgrin, and his brother Baldulf, and thousands more had fell before the Britons. Cheldric, however, escaped the Britons' wrath by flaying. The victory being gained, Arthur commanded Cador, Duke of Cornwall, to pursue Cheldric, while Arthur himself would continue his planned campaign in Albania, where the Scots and Picts were, quote, besieging, quote, Alclud, in which Hoel, king of the Armoricans, still laid sick. I used lots of quotes earlier because it sounds like Arthur wants an excuse to take out the Scots. Anyways, Arthur went to Hoel's assistance in fear that he might fall into the possession of the barbarians. In the meantime, the Duke of Cornwall, with 10,000 men, didn't chase the Saxons right away. He had a better idea. He went and secured their boats, leaving soldiers behind the boats to make sure that the Saxons couldn't, escape over the sea. Then he hastily pursued the enemy as Arthur commanded, and offered no mercy to any of those he could overtake. The Saxons, whose behavior before was so cool and insolent, now of timid hearts fled for shelter to the woods, the mountains, the caves, to prolong their doomed lives. When none of these places could afford them a safe retreat, they entered the Isle of Thanet, east of Kent, with their broken forces. This didn't help them. The Duke of Cornwall still pursued them and slaughtered many of them, including Cheldric, and eventually took hostages, so, he convinced the rest to surrender. Having settled matters here, the Duke of Cornwall directed his march to Alclud, which Arthur had already taken from the barbarians. From there, he conducted his army to Meerif, where the Scots and Picts were besieged. After 3 battles with Arthur and his nephew, the barbarians fled far and found Loch Lomond. They sought refuge on the islands of this lake. This lake contains, according to Geoffrey, 60 islands and is fed by 60 rivers. From what I'm reading in encyclopedias, it's actually closer to 30 islands, but this changes with water level. And the water level must have changed, since Geoffrey claims at this time the lake opened up into the ocean with one mouth. Quote, with one mouth. And there is evidence it used to, but no longer does. So the islands on this lake are very rocky, and lots of eagles lived there. The noises they made at this time of year were very foreboding. Geoffrey says the eagles' cryings were telling of some remarkable event that should happen to the kingdoms. To these islands had fled the Picts and Scots, thinking it was a safe place to make a defense, but it proved of little advantage. Arthur, having got together a fleet, sailed around the lake via the rivers and besieged the enemy for 15 days. The enemy were again dying of starvation, dying by the thousands. During the siege, Guillemarius, king of Ireland, came with a very large fleet with lots of soldiers to relieve his pagan allies. This made Arthur quit the siege and turn his arms against the Irish, who he killed without mercy, chasing any stragglers away back to their country. After this victory, he proceeded in his, let's just say he was this is why I was using quotes earlier. He was basically genociding the Scots and the Picts. He was tired of them. They just always caused problems. He thought it was good for his people, just get the fuck rid of them. It was a pretty successful genocide. It was only stopped late into it as all the bishops of Scotland, who Geoffrey claims are inferior clergy, probably because of there used to be really old In Britain, we've gone over this in this book. There used to be lots of different like subsects of Christianity in Britain. That's probably why Geoffrey doesn't like these. Anyways, these quote unquote inferior clergy met together, came bearing holy relics and other consecrated things of the church. They came barefooted to implore the king's mercy for their people. As soon as they were allowed to see Arthur, they fell on their knees and humbly sought to have him take pity on their distressed country, arguing the sufferings he had caused already were sufficient, and there was no point in ruling the barren recesses of this nation anyways. So they begged to be granted somewhere to settle, willing to bear the yoke the king should impose on them. The king was moved by the religious theatrics and could not deny his clemency to them. With teary eyes, he granted them a pardon. After this, Howell was curious about the lake and went to observe it. He observed the number of inlets and islets were the same and thought this was crazy. And Arthur came up on him and was like, "You think this is cool? Come check this out." Arthur brought him to a nearby pond that was a perfect square, 20 feet on each side. And in each of its four corners was a different type of fish, restricted to their own quarter. Arthur further relayed that there was another pond in Wales near the Severn, called by the Welsh Llanelgwlan, which received water from the ocean, like a small gulf, but it swallowed the tide. So it was never entirely filled. Nearby on the edge of the sea, it spits out all the water it swallows in a spray high as a mountain, which dashes the banks of the seashore. If the locals of that area would stand near the pond and look towards it, they would be swallowed along with the waves. But if they were to look away from it, they would be unharmed, even standing on the banks of the pond. That's definitely a metaphor for something I don't quite understand. It's also probably the precursor to like the Lady in the Lake story. Upon further research, if it is a metaphor, it seems to be one lost to time. Or it could just be, again, Geoffrey and Arthurian literature in general seems to be very concerned with like lakes, magic, ponds, whatnot. After the king had pardoned the Scots, he went to York to celebrate a feast for Christmas. When he entered the city, he saw and grieved at the destruction of the churches. When Archbishop Songso was kicked out, all the temples were burnt, or at least halfway burnt, and there were no longer services being held in York. Arthur assembled clergy and common people alike and appointed Pyramus as his captain of this part of the country. The churches he rebuilt and saw them filled with assemblies of devout Christians, men and women alike. Arthur also restored properties to nobility that had been driven out by the Saxons. There were in that area, vaguely Scotland, 3 brothers of royal blood, Lot, Urien, and Augusel, who, before the Saxons had prevailed, held the government of these parts. Arthur restored upon these subjects, as he had others, the rights of their ancestry. He restored Augusel to princedom over the Scots. His brother Urien he honored with the scepter of Murif, and Lot, who married Aurelius Ambrosius' sister and had 2 sons, Walgard and Modred, Arthur reestablished his rule of Londonesia. At length, when the whole country was restored by Arthur to its ancient state, he married Guanhumara, who was of noble Roman blood, educated by Duke Cador, and one of the most beautiful women in the land. The next summer, Arthur fitted out a fleet and invaded Ireland, which he desired to rule. On landing there, he was met by King Guillemarius with a vast number of men ready to fight, but from the beginning of the battle, the nude and poorly armed Irish were made to flee and fled anywhere they could for shelter. Guillemarius was shortly taken as a prisoner and forced to submit, as were all other kings of Ireland after, High King Guillemarius was used as an example. After he took Ireland, Arthur went to Iceland, which he also conquered. Now a rumor was spreading over the rest of the islands that no country could withstand Arthur. Doldavius, king of Gothland, and Gufasius, king of the Orkneys, came voluntarily to Arthur and formally surrendered, offering to pay him a tribute. Once winter was over, Arthur returned back to Britain, where he resided in peace for 12 years. After that, Arthur brought in famous warriors from foreign nations. He began to expand his domestic army. His court was so slickly and politely ran that other nations would imitate it. Everyone wanted to dress like Arthur's knights. They set fashion trends. Even the fame of Arthur's generosity and valor spread across the world. He terrorized other kings They feared the loss of their kingdoms to Arthur. Being overcome with anxiety, foreign kings repaired their cities and towers and built towns in defensible places in effort to fortify themselves from Arthur. Arthur heard about this and he was just giddy about it. He's just glad everyone's afraid of him. Knowing that he had fear on his side, he began planning his complete and total conquest of Europe. First, he took ships to Norway so that he could get his friend and sister's husband, Lot, the crown of that kingdom. Lot was the nephew of Sicilin, king of Norway, who, now dead, had appointed Lot as successor to the crown, but the Norwegians didn't like Lot, so they put a person named Rykolf on the throne, and having upped the defenses of their cities, were able to oppose Arthur. Walgun, the son of Lot, was then 12 years old. This is kind of a non sequitur Geoffrey randomly drops on us here, but basically, if you're familiar with Arthurian stuff, Walgun is also known as Gaiwan. Arthur arrived at the coast of Norway. King Rykolf, with the whole power of that kingdom, met him and gave him battle. Much blood was lost on both sides. The Britons eventually took the advantage and killed Rykolf in a vigorous charge. Having defeated them, they set the cities on fire, dispersed the country people, and pursued victory until they had reduced all of Norway and Dacia under the dominion of Arthur. After the conquest of these countries, and after Lot had been given his promised throne, Arthur made his way to Gaul. Dividing his men into several armies, he began to lay waste to Gaul on all sides. Gaul, of course, is basically major Western Europe. It's everything west of Germany. It's an old term for France and all that. Everything that's not Germany and like Spain and Western Europe, that's Gaul. Gaul was at this time controlled by Romans, and the governor of the province was Flalo, a Roman tribune, who worked under Emperor Leo. Once he knew Arthur was coming, he raised all the forces under his command and went to fight Arthur, but he lost. Arthur was accompanied by the youth of all the islands he conquered, which resulted in having such an army was reported to be invincible. Even most of the war-worthy Gauls were hired into Arthur's army, so even all the worthy soldiers just knew to go over to Arthur's side anyways. The Romans were out here all alone. Flalo saw he was at a disadvantage, so he left his camp and fled with few soldiers to Paris. There, having recruited an army, he fortified the city and resolved to make his stand there. He was thinking about hiring some foreign auxiliaries when Arthur came. Arthur came and surrounded Paris. A month passed, and being under siege, Flalo's subjects were starving to death. So he sent a message to Arthur that they two alone should decide who owns Gaul, via a one-on-one duel. Flalo was a big guy and pretty confident in himself, so he thought he was going to win if this duel went down. Arthur was elated at Flalo's proposal and sent back a win and where message. So, how this is spelled out, what I'm reading here is they fought on Isle de Cit, or City Island, which in this translation it reads as island without the city, maybe denoting that there were less structures built on the island there. Anyways, it's this island in the middle of Paris. Anyways, people waited on Isle de Cit to see the event. Both combatants were armed gracefully and mounted on lightning-fast horses. The odds didn't seem to be in either combatant's favor at a glance. After Arthur and Flalo presented themselves against each other, with lances aloft, they pushed spurs against their horses and began a fierce battle. Arthur, who handled his lance more warily, struck it into the upper part of Flalo's breast, avoiding his enemy's weapon, laid his enemy prostrate on the ground. Arthur was about to finish him off with his now drawn sword, when Flalo, moving suddenly, crouched and hit Arthur with his lance, killing Arthur's horse, causing Arthur to fall off his horse. The Britons thought they had lost, and they weren't going to let it go. They wanted to start killing Gauls, but just as his men started to move to violence, Arthur stood up and, guarding himself with his shield, rushed Flalo. The battle was renewed with great rage, each combatant passionately wanting the other dead. Flalo, counting his advantages carefully, hit Arthur on the forehead, which would have been a mortal wound, but Arthur's helmet blunted the enemy's weapon. When Arthur saw his coat of mail and shield red with blood, he was inflamed with even more rage. Lifting Excalibur, he struck it with all of his strength, through his enemy's helmet into Flalo's head and disfigured it. With this, Flalo fell, tearing the ground with his spurs, and died. As soon as this news was spread, Paris was open to the Britons, and Gaul was going to be Arthur's. After this victory, Arthur split his army in two, gave one half to Hull, who he ordered to march against Guettard, commander of the Pictavians, while Arthur would continue to subdue other provinces with the rest of the army. Hull entered Aquitaine, gained the cities of that country. He destroyed Gascony with fire and sword and defeated its princes. After 9 years, all parts of Gaul were under Arthur's control. Arthur had returned back to Paris, where he kept his court. I should mention here that Arthurian literature, while popularized with this book, really took off first in France, or Gaul. France is the biggest chunk of Gaul that exists as a country today. Arthur called assemblies of clergy and people, and established peace and just administration of laws. He gave the country of Neustria, or Normandy, to Bedivere, his butler. He gave the country of Antigavia, or Anjou, to his tailor, Caius. Caius. There's a good name. I love that name. Arthur also gave several other lands to several other of his attendants. Having settled the peace of Gaul, he returned to Britain in the spring. When the feast of the Pentecost was coming, Arthur, to demonstrate his joy after his many triumphs and successes, to celebrate the Pentecost solemnly, and to demonstrate his grace to princes which were now his subjects, resolved to hold a magnificent court, to wear the crown, and invite all kings and dukes under his rule to this Pentecostal feast. When he brought this idea up to, well, the book says his friends, but let's face it, powerful kings don't have friends, they have retinues. When Arthur brought this up to his retinue, he pitched the city of Legions as a good place to hold this court. At the time, it was apparently a pretty wealthy city. It sat upon the sea and featured the river Usk, and was apparently a very pretty place, which Arthur considered to be a good place to hold a holy feast. These water features, someone's obsessed with water features. Where's all these water features? Okay, all these water features provided easy access. Kings from all over could sail in from the sea and then up the river, just pull right up to Arthur's court. Legions was also rich in meadows and groves and had great architecture. There were 2 churches there. One was built in honor of the martyr Julius. You may remember him from the St. Alban episode earlier. This church had a choir of virgins who had devoted themselves entirely to the service of God. The other, which was found in the memory of St. Aaron, St. Julian's companion, was full of devoted monks and was the 3rd metropolitan church of Britain. There was also a college with 200 philosophers who, being masters of astrology and other arts, were diligent in observing the stars and gave Arthur true predictions of events that would happen. So, they started setting up court for the ensuing festival. Ambassadors were sent out to invite kings and princes to this court. You guys know how much I love pronouncing crazy to pronounce names. There's a whole paragraph of it. So, hang on, I'm going to get back to this. It might take me another week to get back to this. It's been a week. I'm back to this. Okay. Ambassadors were sent out to invite kings and princes to this court. The guest list reads as follows. Augusel, king of Albania/Scotland. Urien, king of Mirif. Cadwallo Ledwe, king of the Venedocians or North Wales. Sader, king of the Metians or South Wales. Cador, king of Cornwall. All the archbishops of the 3 metropolitan sees of Britain, London, York, and city of Legions, which is, of course, Dubricius. Dubricius was a prelate who was primate of Britain and legate of the apostolical see. Those are lots of Catholic words, I don't know. He was considered so eminent for his piety that he could cure sick people just with prayer. The guest list continues. Consuls of principal cities: Morvid of Gloucester, Maron of Worcester, Honora of Salisbury, Arnthgal of Cargwet, Jugian of Leicester, Cursalin of Chichester, Kinmare of Dorobernia, Gallic of Salisbury, Ergenius of Bath, Jonathan, strangely normal one, of Dorchester, Bosso of Riddoch or Oxford, Besides these consuls, also came the following worthy men. I think this part lists lots of Celtic clan names, but instead of saying Mac or Mick, it says Map. But I'm just going to change everything to Mac. So there was Donat of House Macpopo, Seamus of House McCoyle, Parador of House Macrydor, Gifil of House Macnogoit, Regin of House MacLeod, Edelin of House MacLedoc, Kincar of House MacBagan, Kinmare full stop, doesn't list the house for him, I think. Gorboronium of House McCoy, Rapmaniton, Kimbellum of House MacTrunat, Cathlis of House Macato, Kinlick of House Macneaton, and, according to Geoffrey, way too many others too tedious to enumerate. But wait, actually, this guest list is longer. Read more names out. Okay. From the adjacent islands came Gillemurius, king of Ireland, Malvasius, king of Iceland, Doldavius, king of Gothland, Gunfastius, king of the Orkneys, Lot, king of Norway, Achilles, king of the Dacians. From the mainland came Holden, king of the Rutini, Leodegarius, consul of Bologna, Bedivere, the butler who was made Duke of Normandy by Arthur, Borellius of Cenomania, Caius de Sower, Duke of Atagavia, Guittard of Pictavia. Also came the 12 peers of Gaul, who Gurinius Carnotensis brought along with him. Is that all? No. Howell, Duke of the Armorican Britons, and his nobility came with such a train of mules, horses, and nice furniture that it was difficult to describe. No prince north of Spain refused the invitation to come to King Arthur's festival. No wonder Arthur's name spread. His munificence was celebrated around the world. That was the hardest part of this book so far. Holy crap. So many just names that are outdated by 1,000 years. There was like a normal name in there. There was like Jonathan. That was it. There was someone named John. It's the only name I really recognize from. On the day of the Pentecost, the archbishops went to the palace and prepared to put the crown on Arthur's head. Dubricius, because this court was being held in his diocese, undertook ordering things necessary for this coronation / triumph type thing. Once the king was dressed, he was conducted with ceremony to the metropolitan church, with an archbishop on each side of him, and with 4 kings of Albania, Cornwall, Demetia, and Venedotia bearing 4 golden swords in front of him. He was also attended by bands playing all sorts of music, which made an excellent harmony. Also in this parade was the queen, dressed in her classiest jewelry, conducted by the archbishops and bishops of the Temple of Virgins. The 4 queens, wives of the aforementioned kings, likewise walked in front of her, bearing 4 white doves. Geoffrey says this is ancient tradition. I can't find any evidence for that, but he says that. After the queen, followed a retinue of women cheering. When the procession had ended, music resounded, and musicians crowded into either of the 2 churches. The knights in attendance couldn't decide which church to go to listen to music in, so they switched back and forth, not being yet tired with solemnity, though the whole day had been spent in it. At last, when service had ended at both churches, the king and queen took off their crowns, putting on lighter ornaments. I had imagined this means a diadem or something. Went to the feast. There was one place for the men where the king went, and one place for women where the queen went. For the Britons, quote, still observed the ancient custom of Troy, by which the men and women used to celebrate their festivals apart, end quote. I couldn't find anything on that either, but it is an interesting concept. When everyone had taken their seats, Caius the Sower, in robes of ermine fur, with 1,000 young noblewomen, also clothed in ermine fur, served the food. From another part, Bedivere, the butler, was followed with the same amount of attendants, not in uniform, who served drinks. In the queen's palace were innumerable waiters. Geoffrey says going on about this is too tedious, though, which is the whole three last pages have been pretty tedious, Geoffrey, so I'm going to trust you on that one. At that time, Britain had arrived at new heights of grandeur, abundant with riches, ornaments, and manners that surpassed all other kingdoms. The knights of the kingdom were famous for feats of chivalry, and wore their arms and clothes in uniform color and fashion. The women were celebrated for their wit, and wore the same type of clothes and fashions, and esteemed no one worthy of their love, except for those who had proved their valor in at least 3 battles. So the valor of men was an encouragement for women's chastity, and the love of women a spur to the soldiers' bravery. Once the banquets were over, they went into the fields outside the city to play sports. The military men made a game out of mock jousting, with ladies watching them, darting their amorous glances to encourage the jousters. Others spent the rest of their day in other sports like shooting bows, throwing spears, throwing rocks, throwing dice, all without quarrel. Whoever gained the victory in any of these sports was rewarded with a prize by Arthur. In this manner, the first 3 days of his court were spent, and on the 4th, all who bore any kind of titular office at this court were called to receive honors and promotions in reward for their services. Arthur here filled up vacancies in the governments and cities and castles. He assigned archbishoprics, bishoprics, abbeys, and other offices. St. Dubricius, from a pious desire to live as a hermit, resigned from his office, and in his place, David, the king's uncle, was consecrated, who was taught well by Dubricius himself, and then... Whoa, there's a lot of words here. Oh, okay. He further granted offices to several other priests. Next part. Suddenly, 12 old venerable-looking men showed up, holding olive branches. They uttered hushed, kind words as they made their way to Arthur to deliver him a letter. This paints an eerie picture in my head. 12 old Roman knobs inching towards you to hello, King Arthur. So then they just give you a letter that reads you the worst news of your fucking life. So they brought him a letter from Lucius Tiberius, who is widely considered to be a fictional creation of Geoffrey's. And it reads as follows. Quote, from Lucius, procurator of the Commonwealth, to Arthur, King of Britain, concerning his insolence. The brashness of your tyranny fills me with the highest admiration, and the injuries you have done to Rome increase my wonder even more. But it is provoking to think that you have grown so above yourself as to willingly be ignorant of this, nor do you consider what it is to have betrayed with unjust deeds the Senate, to whom you know the whole world owes vassalage to. Britain was made to pay a tribute to the Senate from the time of Julius Caesar, which has been withheld for quite some time. You refuse to pay us in contempt of our imperial authority. You have stolen the province of the Allobreges and all the islands of the ocean, who, while Roman power prevailed in those parts, paid tribute to our ancestors. Because the Senate have decreed to demand justice of you for such repeat injuries, I command you to appear in Rome before the middle of August next year to make satisfaction to your masters and undergo such sentence as they shall in justice pass on you. If you refuse to do this, I shall come to you and recover with my sword what you, in your madness, have robbed us of. End quote. Once the letter was read in front of the king and his consuls, Arthur took them into the giant's tower at the entrance of the palace. Here they would brainstorm as to how to even respond to such an insanely insolent message. The Romans want 700 years of back taxes or something? And it sounds like they wanted to make a show out of killing Arthur in Rome. As they were headed up the stairs, Cador, Duke of Cornwall, who was a man of merry disposition, said to the king humorously, I have been until now afraid lest the easy life which the Britons led, enjoying a long peace, might make them cowards and extinguish the fame of their gallantry, by which they have raised their name above all other nations. Where the exercise of arms is wanting, and the pleasures of women, gambling, and diversions take place, what remains of virtue, honor, courage, and thirst for praise will be tainted with the rest of idleness. For 5 years we have been abandoned to these delights, and have had no practice in war. To deliver us from sloth, God has stirred up the spirit of the Romans to restore our military virtues to their ancient state. He continued to entertain the men with discourse until they had come to their seats. Once everyone was sat, Arthur spoke to them in this manner, quote, "My companions, through both good and bad, whose abilities in counsel and war I have experienced, this present instance of affairs concerning the message we received considers your careful deliberation and prudent resolutions, for whatever is wisely concerted is easily executed. Therefore, we shall be better able to bear the annoyance Lucius threatens to give us if we unanimously apply ourselves to consider how to overcome it. In my opinion, we have no great reason to fear him. When we reflect upon the unjust presence on which he demands tribute of us, he says he has a right to do so because it was paid to Julius Caesar and his successors who invaded Britain on invitation of the ancient Britons as they quarreled among themselves. By force, they reduced this country under their power when we were weakened by civil war. Because they took it in this manner, the tribute they collected from us was unjust even back then. Nothing can be possessed justly, which is gained by force and violence. He has no reasonable grounds to pretend we are his tributaries, but since he has the presumption to make an unjust demand of us, we have certainly as good reason to demand of him tribute from Rome. Let the longer sword, therefore, determine the right between us. For if Rome has decreed that tribute ought to be paid to it from Britain, on account of us formerly being under the yoke of Caesar and other Roman emperors, I, for the same reason, now decree that Rome has to pay tribute to me, because my predecessors formerly held the government of Rome. For Belinus, king of the Britons, with the assistance of his brother Brennus, duke of the Allobreges, after they had hanged 20 noble Romans in the middle of the marketplace, took Rome and kept it in their possession for a long time. Likewise, Constantine, son of Helena, and Maximian, who were both my kinsmen and wore the crown of Britain, gained the imperial throne of Rome. Don't you therefore think that we ought to demand tribute of the Romans? As for Gaul and the adjacent islands of the ocean, we have no occasion to return the Romans any answer, since they did not defend them when we attempted to free them from Rome's power." End quote. Hoel then replies, hang on, I did Arthur verbatim. This is too verbose for a minor character like Hoel. Hoel says something like, "I think you nailed it. Your reasoning seems more sound than what any of us could think of. All we can do is admire your firmness in mind and depth of policy. If you made an expedition to Rome, I'm sure it'd be a smashing hit. I mean, an excellent film. I mean, a glorious success. Since it would be a just fight against those who unjustly demand things of us. Quote, for that person who would rob another deserves to lose his own by him against whom the attempt is made," end quote. The Britons desire to engage Rome, and this has been promised to us in the Sibylline prophecies. I looked this up actually, and apparently some of the Sibylline prophecies do speak of conquerors coming from one country and three, so this would fulfill such a prophecy as Arthur, according to our subject matter here, would be the third Briton to take the imperial throne if he took it. Make haste, therefore, to receive what God makes no delay to give you, to subdue those who are ready to receive your yoke, and to advance us all, who for your advancement will spare neither limbs nor life. I will accompany you with 10,000 men. When Hoel was finished, Augusel, king of Albania, spoke next. Quote, I am extremely excited Arthur has declared to us his plans. All of our accomplishments are for nothing if the Romans and Germans, Saxons, can enjoy peace. They have brought us grievous injury and should be treated in turn. I am overwhelmingly excited to fight them. Quote, when the blood of those cruel oppressors will be no less acceptable to me than a spring of water is to the thirsty. If I shall live to see that day, how sweet will the wounds which I shall either give or receive be. Even death itself would be glorious in the cause and the glory of our king. Let us take these cowards and rob them of their trophies by making a complete conquest of them. I will add to the army 2,000 horse and foot. The rest present spoke to the same effect and promised a quota of forces. Forces were sent from all over Arthur's newly acquired empire. There's a whole paragraph on the specifics of the forces. I'm just going to tell you that before Armoricans were counted, Arthur's army consisted of 183,000 armed men. That's before the Armoricans joined, which is, Britain's greatest ally. Arthur sent kings back to their country so they could get their forces ready. They would meet at the mouth of the river Barba. From there, they would advance over the lands of the Allobreges to meet the Romans. Arthur sent word back to the Romans with their ambassadors. He said he would not pay tribute. He would come to Rome, but it's not to face judgment of the Senate, but rather to make his own judgment of them. The ambassadors left, so did all the kings and noblemen, to begin the orders which had been issued to them. Next time, Arthur's empire faces off against Rome itself on Ancient Text Podcast. Is that it?